and that is about acquired savant syndrome, where people have a brain injury and all of a sudden they have this explosion of artistic or mathematical or musical ability, often without any training in those fields. What do you make of that?
Well, like everyone else, I'm utterly fascinated by it. I deal with that also in this book, new book, because when you look at acquired savant syndrome following some form of injury, and there are, a dozen cases that I know of where there is a localized injury that gave rise to it. The injury is pretty much always in the left hemisphere. So it looks like a release phenomenon of the right hemisphere, that something that is normally kept in check becomes more possible. And there's some reason to believe this may be the case because of the work of a man called Alan Snyder in Sydney, who applied transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can do this to one hemisphere at a time, and depending on the frequency, you can either stimulate or inhibit. And he inhibited the left hemisphere, left frontal cortex, and he inhibited the right frontal cortex, and he had a control condition in which the person's brain was just functioning in the normal way. And they were asked to approach and solve puzzles. And there's a certain puzzle called the 9-dot puzzle, which, unless you've seen it solved, virtually nobody can solve. And when in the intact normal state, nobody could solve this puzzle. With the right hemisphere, right frontal cortex suppressed, they were no better, in fact, not as good. But with the left frontal cortex suppressed, 40% of them were able to solve the problem. Now, that is staggering, because that's a huge increase. So I think there's quite a lot in that, yes. The difficulty, though, is that mostly autism in itself is very much more like a left hemisphere overdrive syndrome. And I think this is a very complex picture, which has to do with changes we know exist in the corpus callosum, the band of fibers, nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres at their base, in which there are a number of abnormalities in both schizophrenia and autism. And it would take, again, it's not easy to do without diagrams and so forth, but I do talk a bit about that in in this book, which I haven't given a name to. I'm calling it The Matter with Things, which is a pun on several levels, but my editor hasn't yet heard that that's what I'm calling it, so he may have other ideas. We'll see.
Interesting.